In the good old summertime, in the good old summertime.
Let's return just briefly again, Patrick, to the structure of the tournament. So the tournament begins and you go through month by month, both talking about each country's first class matches and then obviously the test matches. And it does become apparent both to the reader, but obviously to the people at the time, the cricket fans, the journalists, that they hadn't worked out this point system. And I think it's by the third or fourth test match, suddenly, and I think it's the journalists who want to record, obviously, the matches and the progress, think, how are they going to work out the champion of this tournament? I mean, how many points do you get for a win? How many for a loss? How many for a draw? What happens if the match is abandoned due to rain? So can you enlighten us? How did they eventually come to this system? And then how did they communicate it to the cricket fans?
As far as I can remember, I wrote this book some time ago, but as far as I can remember, it wasn't until the last test match that they said, well, we don't know who's won. It was quite clear South Africa hadn't won because they'd lost. They hadn't won any of their 6 games, and I think they drew 2 because of the rain. But when they came to the final, the 9th and final game, England had, let me think, they'd drawn both their games against Australia, I think, and England had beaten South Africa 3 times, and Australia had only beaten them twice. So if you've been doing it on a points thing, well, England were ahead on points and only needed to draw the game to win the series, except there wasn't going to be a drawn game in the last one because they decided they would play it to a finish. They pretty much made it up as they went along, said, let's play the last game to a finish, and whoever wins it wins the series. They hadn't decided it's 2 points for a win, 1 for a draw, let alone bonus points or anything like that. No, I think they'd been too busy with other things. It was an oversight. They'd never had a tournament before where you had to have some kind of system of assessing. And I think I said before, frankly, I don't think that anybody cared really. They just wanted to get the thing off the ground. The people who were going to make the rules at the MCC or wherever, they didn't get. They weren't going to be worrying about such minor things of who won and who lost and working out a point system. They wanted to see those players on the field and all rubbing shoulders. And here's the Imperial project. Germany, watch out.
When someone first comes to learn about the 1912 Triangular Series and its, I suppose it's fair to say, subsequent failure as a tournament, one of the first reasons anyone reads about is that it was heavily affected by rain. 1912, you look at the weather, you look at the cricket matches, so many are abandoned or delayed. Just how wet was England in the summer of 1912?
Very, very, very. Well, I think one of the most satisfying pieces of research I did, which is, it's so nerdy.
Right.
I realised how wet it was, and I did get the rainfall figures for the entire 20th century. And I discovered, much to my pleasure, that August 1912, which was the final client, there was no 100 being played in August. They were actually going to play test matches. August 1912 was the second wettest single month of the 20th century, which is,
yeah.
So
Bad timing.
very wet. It's amazing they played any cricket at all in August. There were floods in Norfolk and various other places. It was incredibly wet, but they did manage to play some cricket, and July and June weren't a great deal better. So yeah, it was a phenomenally wet summer. It's amazing that they finished any games, to be honest.
The optimist probably at the time was thinking 10 years earlier, 1902, the Australians in England, that also was a very wet summer, and it produces one of, still today, probably one of the great Ashes tournaments. It's Victor Trumper who's scoring century after century first-class matches, and there's the great matches Jessop's century in the fifth test, and there's the the myth about Wilfred Rhodes get him in singles match, of course.
I'm glad you
Um,
said it's a myth.
it is a myth, no. And for anyone listening and wants to hear about it, go back to the Wilfred Rhodes episode with Patrick. You'll learn all about it. So perhaps at the time they thought it's wet, but we'll plow on. I remember reading your book, you do get this sense that the players, they weren't too downtrodden. They were still like, any moment of sunshine, they would go back out. They would try to create a result, even on the last day. I mean, it's the first innings for each team on the last day, and they're still going out there to perform. Probably speaks to what you've provided so far about how this was a large showcase for the British Empire rather than chasing these victories, is that they just had this duty to perform on the world stage, perhaps.
Yeah, I'd say that's probably true of, I don't know, the English amateurs, that would certainly be true of. The English professionals, I can imagine Wilfred and SF Barnes. I
Yeah,
don't,
yeah.
I,
Yes,
I can imagine there might have been a bit of grumbling there. Although, of course, Barnes would have thought, well, wicket's wet and everything. What we're doing playing out here, but at least I'll take eight for 20 or something on this
exactly.
on
Yes,
this mud patch.
yes.
Um, I can't imagine many of the Australian players, from what I know about them, thought particularly highly of that. Yeah, I mean, yeah, they were sort of hardy souls. They seemed to be used to playing in most conditions. Must have been really hard for the South Africans, because loads
Mm,
of them had never played on a turf wicket before. Because South Africa, I mean, it's an
yes.
important point. South Africa played entirely on matting wickets until the 30s, so only about five or six of them had played on turf wickets before.
Mm.
So that's a little bit of a disadvantage. um,
Absolutely. And to that point, quite different turf wickets, because the South Africans had played Australia in the Australian summer of 1910,
yeah.
11. And
Yeah. Good point.
I
Yeah.
think they lost 4-1, but I think they
Yeah.
beat the Australians in Adelaide, which is surprising because that's quite a hard wicket. And so then coming to England, and again, we take it for granted having to adjust to quite different
Yeah.
wickets. You make a good point about the South Africans, yeah.
I mean, well, there were a number of Australians had never been to England before. They played on turf, and of course, it does rain in Australia, but generally, harder wickets. I know Bardsley and McCartney both came over in
Yes,
1909, so
correct.
it's not a, well, they were the two best batsmen, but it's also not a coincidence that they were the two with English experience.
Mm.
But many of the others would never have played on some of the soft wickets that they encountered day in, day out for 4.5 months in England.
And that is a good segue to the next question, which is some of the other reasons why this tournament perhaps wasn't the success the organisers had hoped.
Well, I think the big one was that neither South Africa nor Australia were able to bring their best teams.
Yes.
South Africa probably wouldn't have been that great anyway, but they lost Bert Vogler, who, unfortunately for him, got involved in a legal wrangle with Abe Bailey. Not a person to go to
Whoops.
court with. Um, and so he wasn't invited to. In fact, he ended up playing in Ireland during the summer instead of playing for South Africa. Um, he would have probably been their best bowler, leg break bowler. Um, Percy Sherwell, the captain, or would have been the captain, and their wicket keeper, he didn't come. Those were the main two, but they weren't a strong team anyway. Schwartz, who'd been very successful in England, another leg break bowler, he hadn't been playing regular first class cricket. Their best batsman, or would become their best batsman, Herbie Taylor, he was still young. Everybody thought he was very good, but he played 40 odd games and didn't score one century. So they were a pretty poor team. They had a couple of bowlers, Sid Pegler, who turned out to be pretty good and liked English conditions. He was their kind of saving grace. They had one brilliant player, Aubrey Faulkner, who was not only a great leg break bowler, but he was their best batsman. He was moderately successful, but only moderately. Um, Soft wickets didn't suit his bowling, and he almost missed the tour because I think he broke his leg in January of that year, but managed to get back and come over. So they not only were they not a good team, or not as good as they had been, and not as good as either England or Australia, but they lost two or three of their best players, so
Mm.
which they could ill afford to do. So they weren't very good. Um, and then we get onto the Australian team, and now Australia had a bunch of really good players at this time. They'd won their previous series in England in 1909, but there was this Big Six dispute about money, so they lost Trumper, Armstrong, their wicket keeper, um,
Sammy Carter,
Sammy Carter, yeah,
Clem Hill,
Clem Hill,
Ransford, Tibby Cotter.
yeah, their best fast bowler.
Yes.
So they lost probably their best all rounder in Armstrong, three of the best batsmen, their wicket keeper, and their best fast bowler. Well, Australia was a pretty powerful cricketing country, but you take six of your 8 or 9 best players out, and you're in a bit of, and Horden as well, who'd been the most successful
Mm.
bowler in Australia for the. I mean, he wasn't part of the Big Six dispute, but he'd been the most successful Australian bowler over the previous 2 series. Um, so probably if the entire squad that came to England, McCartney and Bardsley were the only two who definitely would have got into an Australian first team. One or two of the
Mm.
others eventually would have done, but those were the only two sort of obvious selections. So Australia weren't very good either.
Yeah.
They were better than South Africa, but not nearly as good as they could have been. And the other thing is, I think even if both of those had sent over full strength teams, I don't think crowds would have turned out in massive numbers to watch them play in England, because people tend to want to see their home team,
Yes.
which is a bit sad, but yeah,
Yeah, I've done some recent my own research into the big 1912 dispute here in Australia, and it's interesting from the various perspectives. I mean, we almost universally all refer to them as the Big Six these days. That's Hill, Trumper, Armstrong, Carter, Cotter, and Ransford. But if you look at some of the British press and even some of the Australian press, actually, they often refer to them as the troublesome six. They have different names because at the time they thought that they were going against the board. And I think in relation to the 1912 tournament, the British press thought that they were troublemakers and that they thought they're pulling out of this tournament and it's going to affect the look of the tournament for the British Empire. So that's why they referred to them as the troublesome six. Australians tend to look at them as, pioneers or heroes standing up to the board, a bit like Ian Chappell 50 years later. But
sure,
in
yeah,
reality, they were troublesome for international cricket. It's really interesting to see.
yeah. I think it's not surprising the majority of the British press were against them. Majority of the British press were pretty much against professionalism, full stop.
Yeah.
There've been various set twos in Britain, not in the previous 10 years, but before that, with professional cricketers refusing to play and then being brought to heel by the MCC, or wanting increased fees for playing Test matches, um, and they were stomped on. And I think at the time it'd probably be fair to say that Britain was. I mean, this is going back into history, but Britain was um, pretty economically class-riven. There was a lot of industrial strife in Britain at the time, and people like Warner and Jackson and all the high echelons at the MCC, they weren't really going to take kindly to a bunch of cricketers trying to hold the authorities to ransom. And yeah, they were gonna lose them playing, but I think probably they would have backed the Australian Cricket Board in refusing to pick them. It was a question of who runs the game and the long term outlook for cricket, and the MCC and the ACB and so on. They've got to be in charge. You can't have players, getting above themselves and trying to run the game. And in a sense, I suppose it does look a bit ridiculous now that when the Australians came to England, they organised it as a private venture and pocketed all the cash, and that kind of system had to come to an end. It's a bit unfortunate it came to an end in 1912. To be honest, if the other six had come, it still would have rained a lot.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
the games between England and Australia would have been a lot more interesting.
Yes, because those names, certainly Hill, Trumper, and Armstrong, were big household names. I mean,
Yeah,
they'd been to England 4 or 5 times by that
yeah,
stage. There is the counter argument, Patrick, and I'll just throw that out there, that in 1912, the Big Six, or however we want to refer to them, they weren't the six best players. You could argue that, I mean, Hill had a pretty poor previous Ashes for various reasons, perhaps other things on his mind, and was nearing retirement anyway. He hadn't toured in 1909. He was very comfortable financially, didn't need to. Trumper was probably at the dawn of his final illness, which struck him down just 3 years later. Armstrong was a bit hit and miss, really, with whether he'd turn up or not. And the others, I mean, Tibby Cotter possibly had lost his pace at that stage. So you could
yeah. And
argue,
I don't think Cotter would have made no difference on those wickets. I mean,
yeah,
he'd have just had a horrible time falling over trying to bowl fast. Yeah, I think Ransford might have been actually. He was the one whose career was actually really on the up.
mm,
Um,
mm,
and and Trumper, you never knew really. I mean, he did play some great innings only the year before in Australia,
in Australia, yeah,
against South Africa, against England, and before that against South Africa. So he still was a
mm,
remarkable player, and he did like English conditions, and
mm,
he also would have been a huge draw because,
absolutely,
like it or not, Trumper was the golden boy, and not just in Australia, he was in England as well.
mm,
Um, and Armstrong, partly because of his size and his imposing stature,
mm.
he was a big draw as well. People like to, if only to hope he failed. I don't think he was particularly popular, but you had to admire how good he was.
Yes,
Um,
yes,
it
and
must have been quite a sight watching him bowl leg breaks, but he did it very, very well. And Clem Hill, well, yeah, I mean, you're absolutely everything you say about him is right, but he had done it in England before, and
mhm.
he would have been better than any other Australian batsman who did come, with the obvious two exceptions of McCartney and Bardsley.
And perhaps their absence gave Bardsley and McCartney the opportunity to shine and play every match, because if Hill and Trumper and Armstrong were also there, it's a pretty top heavy batting lineup. I mean, I'm sure you would find room, but without those senior players there,
Yeah.
Bardsley and McCartney obviously were
Well, I think
allowed to
McCartney
play.
would have like he did in 1909, would have gone down the order and bowled a lot more, because
Yes.
actually he could have done with a lot of bowling because of the soft wickets. Finger spin would have been useful,
Mm,
and both the touring teams were rather lacking in that.
mm.
McCartney would have been, yeah. I think they would have found a way. They would have
Yes.
found a way, but I don't think it would have massively helped the bowling, because the only bowler well, you could say Armstrong as an all rounder, but Cotter was the only bowler in the Big
Mm,
Six, and he was a fast bowler, and it was not a fast bowler's year. So
yes.
yeah, he'd have struggled.
You're old, but you're awfully tough. I'm old, but I'm awfully tough.
Well, this discussion is a natural segue into the next segment, which is all about the statistics. Normally, at this point in the podcast, we go through a particular player's career, first class, and test. Obviously, we're talking about a tournament. So, Patrick, I'm just going to reel off some numbers. Feel free to chip in at any point. Looking at the final tally from the tournament, England won 4 matches, lost 0, and they drew 2 matches. Australia won 2, lost 1, and drew 3 matches. And South Africa, poor South Africa, 1-0. They lost 5 and they drew 1 match, each playing 6, of course. We look at the individual statistics from the tournament. The leading run scorers for each country were, for England, Jack Hobbs, not surprising, 391 runs. For Australia, Warren Bardsley pipped Hobbs by 1 run. He scored 392 runs. And for the South Africans, it was Dave Norse with 220 runs. For the bowlers, the leading wicket takers for each country, definitely not surprising. For England, it was Sydney Barnes with a quite astounding 39 wickets. And this is interesting because he's in a real purple patch at this stage. I mean, when was he not in a purple patch? But I think he'd taken 42 wickets in the just gone Ashes series in Australia. And then he, of course, goes to South Africa and does all sorts of records, which still stand today. So he
49 in 4 matches.
Yes, it's this record that will probably never be beaten. For Australia, it was Bill Whitty with 25 wickets. And for the South Africans, Sid Pegler, as you previously mentioned, Patrick, with 29 wickets, was their leading wicket taker. One of the great little morsels of trivia that lasts from the 1912 triangular series is the fact that the Australian leg spinner, Jimmy Matthews, took 2 separate hat-tricks in the same match. And it happened to be the first match of the tournament. I mean, that's a promoter's dream. It was against South Africa at Old Trafford. Possibly no one was there,
And he
unfortunately.
took them on the same day as well.
On the same day, but in different innings, is that right?
Yeah, in different innings, sorry. Yeah.
Yes. So he must have taken, the last 3 wickets of one innings or thereabouts, and then obviously the South Africans must have followed on, and he then took...
I can't remember exactly. What I do remember, though, is that the South African wicketkeeper, Tom Ward, was he was involved in both the hat-tricks. He was out first ball on his test debut
Yeah, wow.
in both hat-tricks.
Immediately a bunny. And those
Yes.
those 6 wickets were Jimmy Matthews' only 6 wickets of the entire match, which again is extraordinary. But
exactly. Yes.
He remains to this day the only cricketer in Test cricket history to take 2 hat-tricks in a single match, which is why this is a piece of trivia that often is thrown about today. So there you go, Jimmy Matthews.
Well, particularly as he didn't really have a great career either before or after this series. That was his golden day.
His claim to fame, so to speak, yes. So, Patrick, as we sort of near the end of the discussion about the 1912 triangular series, what was the immediate wash-up of the tournament? Did the organisers salvage anything from it?
Not really. That it rained a lot, that the cricket wasn't very good, mainly because of the rain, but also because the South Africans, I think people knew the South Africans probably weren't going to be very good, and it only took about a month to realise they were no better than had been expected. The Australians were expected to be, I think, a little bit better than they were, but everybody knew that losing the big 6 was going to be a huge handicap. Couple of the Australian players did come out. Well, obviously the 2 we mentioned, Bardsley and McCartney, but Bill Whitty turned out to be a decent bowler. Hazlitt did all right, and it did come down to the last game. I mean, once they tinkered with the rules a bit. and yeah, England won it pretty comprehensively. Although there wasn't a, and I'm really going to try and cast my mind back now. There was an absurdity to the last game that it was because Hazlitt had an amazing. He took 5 wickets very quickly, which finished England's innings. Quite a big England's first innings. Quite a big. Australia still had quite a big deficit, but it got Australia back in very quickly. They then got bowled out, and England won. Now, if Hazlitt hadn't taken those 5 wickets and um, England had battered on for a bit longer, which they obviously would have done to try and get a bigger lead, Australia would have gone back in later. And as it turned out, the rain started coming down just as Australia were out in the second innings, and the rain continued for 3 days.
Mm.
So actually, even though they were trying to play the game to a finish, they pretty much decided that it could only be for 6 days because of contractual agreements to go to Ireland.
Mm.
So Hazlitt's great performance, taking all these quick wickets, actually cost Australia the game. It almost certainly would have been rained off if he hadn't done that. So I mean, that was the final farce at the end, was that Australia sort of did too well at the end of England's first innings and shot themselves in the foot, and allowed Australia to get back in and be bowled out and lose the series. So it's the final nail in the coffin, almost, of
Yes.
what was a total disaster.
This is a completely hypothetical, but had the outbreak of the First World War not occurred, had the lights not gone out, as your title suggests, do you think another triangular series would have been planned or at least discussed?
I I very much doubt it, to be honest. I think it was such a mess. Um, the Australians didn't make the money they wanted to. The South Africans made they made a loss, which A. Bailey made good. It messed up the county season, and county cricket at that time really was important. I mean,
Mm.
many people thought Test matches had got in the way a bit,
Mm.
including a lot of the players. Um, I don't think there would have been another one, because also I think people realised there was no appetite to watch two neutral teams play against each other. The English crowds weren't really interested in watching Australia play South Africa. They wanted to see England play. Um, no, I really doubt it.
And so, what is the legacy of this 1912 triangular tournament today? Were there any lessons learnt?
Well, I don't know if there were lessons learned. I mean, I think it still has a serious historical, as well as cricketing, but probably more important historical relevance in why the series was played. And I know I keep harping back to this, but I mean, I do think it is important. It's an early example of politics coming into cricket.
Mm.
Now I know that has, that has gone for the next 100 and more years, about where politics and where the influence of certain countries resides, and to some degree that still holds true today in all levels of sport. Should the Football World Cup have taken place in Doha? Is it right that that India pretty much rule the roost financially in world cricket? They would, of course, argue that the MCC did it for a long time, so why shouldn't they have their turn? Which is absolutely fair enough. Um, it's a hard one, but I think in terms of its political significance and why it took place, and how sport could be harnessed to be part of politics. I suppose the most obvious reference point is what happened with South Africa, and South Africa being excluded from cricket in the late 70s, the apartheid ban, and how certain cricketers thought they would still go there, and politics and cricket, politics and sport don't mix. Well, people always say that when it suits them. The two do mix, and I'm just
Mm.
going to refer back to one of my favourite quotes of my entire book, which is by Brian Clough, the football manager,
Mm-hmm.
who talked about politics and sport. And he said, they say sport and politics don't mix, which is rubbish. It's like saying you don't need oxygen to breathe. You can't have one without the other on this earth. I think people who keep politics out of sport are a bit simple. Um, I,
Mm.
I think you could go a bit further than that and say that they're not so much simple as they're self-serving.
Mm.
When Mike Gatting and people like that went to South Africa and said, "Yeah, we're cricketers, we're not politicians." Yeah, what a load of old tripe. I
Mm.
mean, he went for the money, and it suited him to say that. Excuse me about Mike Gatting; he wasn't the only one, but he's the one that's. Oh,
Mm.
Jeff Boycott spring to mind as well. Um, Drivel, absolute drivel. I mean, politics and sport do reside together, and the people who say they don't are the ones who are trying to make something out of it. And politics was very much to do with this particular event,
Mm.
and if all the best players had come, and if the summer had been sunny, it would have been the classic sort of Edwardian summer of white flannels on perfect green pitches, and
Mm.
everybody's very happy, and so on and so forth, before the cataclysm of 1914. I've never really much bought into that image anyway. I mean, all grouse shooting and so on and so forth. It was all very wonderful in the late Edwardian era for the rich people.
Mm.
For
Yes.
most people, it was a time of massive industrial strife.
Mm-hmm.
It was the start of the first wave of the state taking over things like the Old Age Pension Act,
Mm-hmm.
followed by the Unemployment Act. I mean, those two um, were really significant improvements, but they didn't stop all the strikes. Britain was absolutely beset by strikes in 1911 and 1912. Economically, it was a real bad time. Plus, of course, there was the threat of war, which, as we all know, did come to pass.
Yeah. This is completely by the way. I grew up, I'm going to show my age here, but watching cricket in the 1990s in Australia, where the one day series was a triangular series.
Mm.
You might recall, it would be
Yeah, yeah,
Australia versus England and often South Africa, but usually not one of the big nations. It might have been Zimbabwe, or for a while there they had the Australia A side, and it actually worked for a while. I mean, it's a different time. I know this is 80 years after the triangular tournament of 1912, but from a television perspective, I feel like it worked well. I mean, I don't have the statistics to back that up. Obviously, in 1912, they didn't have that technology, but um, I often enjoyed sitting back on the couch and watching England versus whomever, New Zealand, play each other at the Adelaide Oval or the MCG. It was interesting, and it was something different. And perhaps the
What
legacy
what were
of
the crowds like at the ground, though?
oh, terrible! Yeah, absolutely terrible. I mean, it was all
Yeah,
empty seats, and it did look odd because, again, this is the heyday of one-day cricket, where Australia, England at the MCG would get 70,000 plus. I mean,
yeah,
I remember going to those and just being, as a youngster, just being blown away by the size of the crowd. This is possibly the legacy of the 1912 tournament, is that they tried it again in various formats, and from a viewership, or at least from the technology of watching it on screen. I mean, from a cricketer lover's perspective, you're just watching, New Zealand versus England play at the Gabba, or the Sydney Cricket Ground. I mean, who cares how many people are
sure.
there? It's a great experience. It's just a shame in
Yeah.
1912 they had to actually rock up, which the crowd just didn't do.
No, they didn't. And I mean, you could also say, I mean, it's quite common now that two teams will come to England in the same summer,
Mm,
as long as it's not Australia or India. Um, so we have a summer, say maybe where South Africa and Sri Lanka come. They both play 3 Test matches against England. It's quite noticeable that they don't ask South Africa to play against Sri Lanka in England and make a
yes.
triangular tournament of it. I mean, it's clearly there is no appetite for neutral ground test matches. I, I think one day games have got more of a chance.
Mm,
Um, some people might say, well, that's because people who go to one-day games aren't as interested in the traditions of cricket as people who go to test matches. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not. I don't know.
mm,
The game is where it is now. Even if this had been successful, well, I suppose if it had been successful, then maybe people inevitably would have looked in the 1920s. Let's repeat this. It was great in 1912. Let's have another one. But it was unsuccessful for so many reasons. But if the weather had been nice, if all the best players had come, it would have been better. I still don't think it would have been a massive success. I still think most people would have said, we'd rather have had the Australians here for 5 tests. Look, there's Victor Trumper, there's Clem Hill, there's Warwick Armstrong. We'd like to see them all summer and not, you know, the South African team who weren't very good.
yes. Well, it did happen, and it makes for lively discussion. So I thank you, Patrick, for coming on the podcast for your second time. I obviously didn't scare you away the first time. I appreciate it.
No, not at all. It's a
And
it's a great pleasure, refreshing my memory of 130,000 words that I wrote 10 years ago.
I do heartily, genuinely recommend your book. So the title is "Before the Lights Went Out: The 1912 Triangular Tournament" by Patrick Ferriday. A great read. What I was going to compliment you on again, Patrick, was I loved the newspaper snippets, the headlines that
Yeah,
accompanied
thank you.
each month. So it not only put the tournament in cricket perspective, but in global perspective. Things like, as I mentioned at the top of the show, the sinking of the Titanic, the strikes happening in Britain at that time. It really, I think, from a reader's point of view, helped put this rather bizarre tournament in context at the time. So,
I should mention that idea is completely nicked from John Dos Passos, the
ah,
American writer who did the same in his book USA. Just to provide context of, I think he called it newsreel, and he literally did the same thing using different fonts, putting different headlines in, just to remind you where, well, he was reminding you where America was and what was going
yes.
on in America at the same time as his fictional characters were doing their things. It did seem important, and particularly, the sinking of the Titanic obviously
Mm.
was the big one, but there were plenty of other, and some of the stories were just ridiculous as well, and it gave a flavour of the time.
No, I really enjoyed it. So well done. And thank you again for coming on the podcast. It's always enjoyable.
Thank you.
That's all for this episode. Please subscribe to the podcast on whichever platform you're listening, leave a review, or perhaps you'd like to buy me a coffee to help sustain the podcast into the future. Visit buymeacoffee.com/golden age of cricket. My name is Tom Ford. Take care of yourself, and until next time, it's bye for now.